I want to welcome everybody. Hello. Hello to everybody who's joining us remotely and to everybody who's here at Schoodic Institute for the inaugural Goldstein lecture. I'm Hannah Weber. I'm the Marine Ecology Program Director here at Schoodic, and I'm the MC for the afternoon. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on Wabanaki territory for this lecture. And in a moment, I'll ask Nick Fizzakelli, the president and CEO of Schoodic, and Kevin Schneider, the superintendent for Acadia National Park, to come on up and take the stage. First, a few housekeeping notes. 1, if you need a bathroom, go up the stairs into Rockefeller Hall, take the center door once you've gotten up onto the outer patio, and then take a right, and you'll find bathrooms. You can also walk around the building and up front if the stairs present a challenge. If you have your cell phone with you, please silence it. Thank you. In the event of a severe thunderstorm, we will all egress to Rockefeller Hall. You never know. And this event is being recorded and will be uploaded onto the Schoodic Institute YouTube channel for later viewing. With that, that's all I have for housekeeping. I'm going to ask Nick Fizzakelli, the president and CEO of Schoodic Institute, and Kevin Schneider, the superintendent at Acadia National Park, to come to the stage. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much, Hannah. Thanks, everybody, for coming today, and thanks to our special guest speakers that we have with us, and you'll get to hear lots more from them. So again, I'm Nick Fizzakelli. I'm the president and CEO with Schoodic Institute at Acadia National Park. We are a nonprofit partner of the National Park Service and Center for Inspiring Science, Learning, and Community for a Changing World. And today's event, the Goldstein Lecture, is in honor of Alan Goldstein. Alan has served on the board of Schoodic Institute since its inception 17 years ago, and he spent most of that time as the chair of the board. Alan's leadership and tireless efforts have positioned us to be a leader in science and education and part of the community here on the Schoodic Peninsula. And we're very fortunate to have Alan with us today. Alan, can you raise your hand for everybody? Thank you very much, Alan. Our focus here at Schoodic Institute is understanding the consequences of rapid environmental change and engaging people in the science and solutions. And I believe there's no better place to do this work than within our national parks. These are the places holding our natural heritage and also our cultural heritage. And there are enormous challenges to the rapid changes that are happening that require a diversity of perspectives and science communication and engagement. And there's so much opportunity as well in all of these challenges. Sometimes you forget about the opportunities, but they really do exist. I was working with high school science teachers last week that came here to campus for immersive citizen science experience, and one shared her teaching philosophy with me, and she said, "The struggle is where the learning happens." And the rapid changes facing parks and society are great struggles. And it's up to us to make the learning happen and to foster a better future. And so we're super fortunate also to do this work here with our National Park Service partners, the staff at Acadia, led by Superintendent Kevin Schneider. And Kevin and his staff are engaged in these struggles and in the learning and in stewarding this cherished place through rapid change. So please join me in welcoming Kevin.
It's so great to be with you all here together in person on this incredible campus. You know, our national parks in this country are a treasure. They are the most precious places we have. Places like Acadia, like Glacier National Park, North Cascades, you name it, the list goes on. These are the most special places in our country that really articulate who we are as Americans, from places like Yellowstone to the battlefields of Gettysburg or the home and birthplace of Dr. Martin Luther King. This is what makes us American. And they're also an incredible place for science. And this is something that we have an incredible opportunity with the brand that we are. More than 300 million people a year come to see us at America's national parks. Here at Acadia, we'll likely have more than 4 million visitors this year. We're going to set a record. And what that means is we have an opportunity to talk to those people about the changes that we're seeing here in our national parks. These are places that are often at the most sensitive locations in our country, just like here, where we have the intersection of the boreal forests of the north and the more temperate forests of the mid-Atlantic, or Saguaro National Park, where you have these very unique conditions that allow for saguaro cactus, or Glacier National Park, where you have glaciers that are still so easy to observe, yet are changing rapidly. And so we have a responsibility to talk to the public about what we're seeing and talk to the public about the incredible science that's occurring here. And so I believe that science communication is among the most important things that we can be doing in the National Park Service. And we do it with our partners. Schoodic Institute, for example, is such an important way of getting this work done by doing this through partnerships. So I'm really excited about the conversation today. We have some incredible speakers to learn about how we can sort of sharpen our pencils with science communication, do a better job at it, and ultimately be able to deliver this message for the American public. So thank you all for being here today. Thank you for being part of this. Thanks to Schoodic Institute, to Nick, David Elwood, the board chair, for hosting us, and our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Kevin. It's awesome. Now, we're all invited to be flies on the wall. We're all invited to sort of listen in. I don't know if any of you have ever listened in on a subway conversation or listened to the table next to you when you're at dinner. I've done both. Just saying. Anyway, we get to listen in on a conversation between colleagues who think deeply about communicating and engaging in science in a rapidly changing world. And we all just get to listen in on their conversation this afternoon. So let's put on our listening ears. And I'd invite to the stage first Catherine Schmitt, the science communication specialist here at Schoodic Institute, who will be moderating the conversation today. I also invite to this stage Raj Pandya, who is the director of the Thriving Earth Exchange, Andy Revkin, who's the director of the Initiative on Communication, Innovation, and Impact at the Earth Institute at Columbia University, and Bina Venkataraman, editorial page editor at the Boston Globe and fellow at the New America. So, thank you all for being here. Let's hear it.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Nick and Kevin, and thank all of you for being here. It turned out to be a beautiful day, so we're so lucky to be together and in person, and I'm really excited to have this conversation, and we are going to structure it like a conversation where I'll be asking questions, but you should all feel free to talk to each other and ask questions of each other as well. We do have to share the microphone, so that's gonna make things a little less smooth than it might be, but I hope you enjoy. And I do want our guests to share a little more about themselves as a way of introduction to our audience. And all of you are either in new roles or you've recently started new initiatives. And I'd just like you to share a little bit, each of you, about those roles and initiatives, and maybe the biggest thing you've learned since starting that role or initiative, or something that sort of surprised you along the way. And Raj, we'll start with you because you're right here.
Thank you. So it's not actually that new, I guess. I've been doing it for about 8 years. And until I got here and visited Schoodic, I thought I had the coolest job in the world. It's really kind of simple. What we do is I work for a large organization of professional scientists, about 60,000 members, and I run a program that helps those members connect with community leaders. And what's cool about it, what's unique about it, is we begin with the community leaders asking questions about the places they live, the places they work, the places they play, and we find scientists who can help them design work that can answer those questions. And it ranges from really tiny stuff. We worked with the city of Midway, Georgia, which was a little tiny town. The Mayor Washington, she was interested in building a new city hall, and she wanted to build her city hall in a way that was a refuge from floods and used green energy. And so we helped her find a scientist who could do that. That was one of our smallest projects. One of our biggest projects was with a food distribution network that was based in Boston that delivered food to about 8 million people. And it didn't have a climate change plan. So it wanted to think about what would it do to be resilient to big events and still deliver food over 2 weeks in the course of recovery from those events. How could it do that? And so it's really that's what I do. And what I'm surprised about, which I probably shouldn't be, is how much other stuff besides science is necessary to do this work. What I sort of think about is science is necessary but not sufficient. It needs to be at the table, but it's not the only thing at the table.
I love that. Is it the Greater Boston Food Bank that you worked with in Boston? Yeah. Oh, great. That's they've been working overtime in the pandemic, making sure we can feed as many hungry people as possible in the region. So it's interesting to know they're also thinking very long term about the climate crisis. So I'm Bina, and it's great to be here with all of you. There's different ways to answer your question, how did I come to this work? And I'm a journalist. I've also worked in the area of climate policy, trying to bring the science of climate change to decision makers in businesses and communities, and really bring it to where people live and make decisions. And the work as a journalist now involves leading the opinion section and the editorial board of the Boston Globe, where we do try to write about our changing planet from all sorts of different levels and perspectives, whether it's trying to encourage our congressional delegation in Massachusetts to take a certain policy stand on climate legislation, or whether it's about a local issue where we want to see the city think about a development from the perspective of sea level rise and how that will affect the communities of people in that community, in that region or area or neighborhood. But I will say that when I think about science communication, one of the surprises, one of the things I really learned in my time working in climate policy, I worked in the Obama White House in 2013 and 2014. And I went in thinking, we have all of this great research on climate change, and we just need to get it to people, and they will make better decisions. They just need to know about the wildfires coming and the heat waves and the droughts and the storms, and then they're going to make better decisions. And they just need that information in a way that's relevant to their lives. And I came out of that time realizing that it wasn't just about communication. To Raj's point, it wasn't just about sharing the science and the information. There was so much more that went into the process of making decisions. So information is not the same as wisdom. As I like to say, a good forecast is not the same as foresight. To use that forecast to make decisions to make your life better in the future, or your family's life better in the future, or even your communities or your societies. So that all led me to writing a book called The Optimist Telescope, which is all about how people can, thanks Catherine, it's all about how people can do better at thinking ahead in what I call a reckless age. And I went around the world talking to people in communities, talking to all kinds of different experts, trying to understand what allows people to think ahead when we do. And so the way I think about science communication now is more as is almost more as a piece of how we try to make better decisions for the future. So how can we make our futures better? How can we make our families' futures, our children, our grandchildren's future better? And I do think, as Raj said, the information being a part of that and predictions being a part of that, but really very much thinking about imagination and thinking about people's emotional responses, and thinking about how we can knock down some of the barriers that get in the way of making those decisions.
So there's a theme here, definitely, and you'll see why I say that in a second. I grew up in Rhode Island wanting to be a marine biologist because there was a guy named Jacques Cousteau, who, those of you who spent most of your life like me in the 20th century, remembered this guy on TV every Sunday night, I think it was. And I had the gift of living in Rhode Island, so I could actually put on a snorkel and mask and see the wonders underwater. I migrated from science to science journalism in my late 20s. I decided to become more of a storyteller than a science pursuit, have science pursuit, to write about the pursuit of knowledge through science, and as opposed to doing the work. And I sort of went along, I started writing about climate change in the mid-1980s. I was an early arriver on that beat, and I never left it. 1988 was my first magazine cover story about global warming. Big, flashy Discover magazine cover with like a melting planet, and it's very dramatic, and got a lot of attention, and did more and more. I went to the New York Times, where I wrote probably 2,000 stories and blog posts on global warming. Went to the North Pole, the Vatican. I exposed misbehavior in the White House under one president, and I kept thinking, I was doing my job as a journalist, but then I stumbled into this other science, behavioral science and social science. It took me 18 years of writing about global warming, greenhouse gases changing things, before I interviewed a social scientist. It was the biggest failure of my career. And then there was a woman, Helen Ingram, 2006. I'll remember this interview very well. That was when Al Gore's movie had come out, and the issue got very inflammatory. And I was talking with her social scientist about this. She said, well, in terms of like voting, she said, people vote on things that are soon, salient, and certain. And I thought, oh my God, because so many aspects of the climate problem, even today, what we think of as just being a real-time phenomenon, a lot of what we're seeing today is actually overdue fires that should have burned. It's not just global warming we're seeing all kinds of vulnerability playing out, including floods. It's mostly a backloaded story. And then I talked to more and more scientists, and they talked about things like, well, all these biases, status quo bias, confirmation bias, we have a bias to think that what's here now is the thing that will be. And so we all doubt, we don't change. And that got me realizing more and more that should I spend the rest of my life doing journalism, which is unidirectional storytelling, me going out with a pad, like I've just been taking notes about rockweed, and then writing it up and telling you back your story. And then maybe we'd get a letter or two. And now in the internet age, we get tweets back and stuff. As opposed to spreading the capacity for scientists, students, teachers, community members to tell their own story. Well, I came to Columbia University, where I had taught journalism way back as an underpaid adjunct, 15 years ago. And I pitched them the idea at the Earth Institute of creating an initiative that gets beyond storytelling. It's like, okay, we have a new information environment, everyone. It's not just Walter Cronkite and the New York Times front page anymore. It's this morass of stuff that we're all swirling in. Can we make that work better for communities at risk and for scientists trying to inject a little bit of knowledge into disputes that are so much not about knowledge? And so for 2 years now, we've been building that. My biggest surprise was simply that, the failure to recognize that until now, recently, that there's great value in finding ways to propagate stories, not to tell stories, to facilitate the exchange of knowledge and information. One exciting project at Columbia, just to give you an example, and this was thanks to the Moore Foundation, some Arctic scientists were going up to the Chukchi Sea, north of the Bering Strait, to work in a community, an Inupiat community, an indigenous community there, on sea ice. What's happening with the sea ice? But the project from the very start is a conversation. Not typically when scientists, you get a grant, and there's this thing called broader outcomes, and you have to write a couple of paragraphs. We'll put up a website, and we'll have a town meeting in Inupiat, in the village in Kotzebue, and then we'll go home. This is so different. It's from the start, it's a conversation between an affected community that says, what we want to know about sea ice is when can we drive our snowmobiles out there and not drown? Can you help us with that? So it's become a co-production of science, not even just a co-production of knowledge. It's a co-production of a pursuit of a question. And that stuff excites me way more than telling a better story.
One question in, and I'm already going off script. Mostly because I want to build on a couple things, Andy, that you've said. And one builds on this idea that all of you have been doing this work for many years and communicating about rapid change for many years. So Andy, I think you said 1988 was your first cover story on climate change, and so I've been doing this for 20 years, and I've written now the third report on climate change in Maine, the third one, which is out on the table there, numerous articles, and it doesn't seem to make a difference sometimes. And I just wonder if maybe Bina and Raj, you can share a little about sort of what changes have you made in your own work to keep up with the rapid change and to acknowledge this idea that information alone isn't going to make a difference, and just share a little bit more. I think we all live this every day, but I think people would benefit from more examples of what that looks like.
Sure, happy to. So one of the, I mentioned imagination, and so one of the insights in trying to get at this deeper problem of why people don't make decisions on behalf of their future selves or future kids, even though we care about our future, right? We all care about somebody young in our lives, whether it's a student or a niece or a nephew. And yet, here we are where we're making decisions that are mostly about the here and now and not about the changing climate and how that's going to affect the future, let alone the present. And one of the gaps there really is that you can get really good information. So there are studies of hurricane forecasts that show that people who receive hurricane warnings in regions that haven't experienced a severe hurricane in a long time will often do little more than just buy bottled water. They won't evacuate. And so we saw this play out in numerous disasters. And that's people even who have the resources. So there's obviously issues of disparity where sometimes people can't afford to evacuate, or they have pets and they can't get the pets on the evacuation buses and things like that. But even people who have the resources and the information who don't evacuate. And what you see when you study what happens after there's been a devastating storm or a devastating earthquake is that people start to almost overact in anticipation of the disaster that's most recently happened. So earthquake insurance, people buying it, the purchasing rate goes way up after an earthquake, and the same happens with flood insurance after big storms. So this connects to something in the cognitive science, which is that we rely on our episodic memory when we project ourselves into the future. So we rely on things that we know have happened in the past to us, or people we know, or movies we've seen, when we imagine the future. And that has limits because the future doesn't always look like the past. It doesn't always look like what we've experienced. And so, just as an example, the COVID-19 pandemic was not like H1N1, which fizzled out and wasn't a big deal. So we have to get better at this action of imagining futures we have yet to experience that our episodic memory won't help us conjure. And so I wanted to study that and get at that and bring that into my work more. And some of the methods that allow people to better imagine the future, they go from the very low tech to the very high tech. So one of them that I've discovered that a pair of behavioral economists are working on is having people write letters to their future selves or to a future child or grandchild to be opened 25, 50 years in the future. And in the process of writing these letters, they found that people showed afterwards greater care for the future. And why is that the case? Well, one theory is that what's happening when you write a letter to a human being to be opened in the future, even if it's your future self, is that you're taking yourself into the future, you're inhabiting a scenario in the future, but not in an abstract way, not in a way that's like, okay, there's going to be 3 feet of sea level rise by this year, and I'm going to try to imagine what that looks like on the coast of Maine. No, you're imagining a human being in their neighborhood, in their home. You're trying to understand what their lives are going to be like, and you're writing to them to tell them what you're thinking about today, what you're doing today, to help make that future better for them. And so I think of it as almost imaginative empathy. So how can we help people connect to their future selves and empathize with their future selves or with human beings in the future? The way that it was once really hard to relate to and be empathetic with human beings from across the globe, until people started seeing those images of children in Vietnam during the war, it was harder for people to empathize with wars that were happening somewhere else far away. Well, here we're talking about far away in time people. And so I really tried to think about that imagination gap. And the other thing I'll just say that I studied and have written about is the use of virtual reality to bring people into environments in the future. So there's a virtual reality lab at Stanford University, for example, that is putting people in the virtual environment of a coral reef where they get to swim in the coral reef. And you're wearing, I did this, by the way, and you're wearing a headset, and you have a lot of the feedback that makes you feel like you're really there. And then the reef suddenly changes, and the reef is suddenly the reef in the year 2100 when the ocean has acidified and a lot of the coral has died off. And it's giving people an experience. They studied this and they compared it to people just reading about coral reef die-off. And they found that the people who swam in the coral reef, the virtual coral reef, actually had sustained concern for longer. And, that relates to them being able to actually imagine what that's like. So I think that helping people really be able to imagine, empathize with future people has become much more of a strain of my work, and that's something I've learned.
That's a cool example. I like that idea that sort of part of why we respond is because of how we feel, and I think that's cool. There's taking a slightly different answer. One of the Kara Pike said something. She's a climate change communicator, and she said something that was that stuck with me, and it was, instead of talking about the co-benefits of climate adaptation, talk about climate adaptation as a co-benefit of what people are interested in doing now. And there's some great examples of that have been really inspiring for me. One is Angela Chalk, who's a leader in New Orleans, sort of a community leader, and she sort of went around to her neighborhoods and said, what are you worried about? And they were worried about urban blight, and they were worried about flood vulnerability, and they were worried about poor air quality. And she started a program to plant trees in the neighborhood with people in the neighborhood. And then she talked with folks about how planting that tree was also protection against urban heat island, and what kinds of changes in the environment they had noticed over the last 10, 15, 20 years since they'd lived there. And that was a way for her to enter into a conversation about climate change, beginning with sort of the things people were interested in. And I thought that was a really powerful strategy, and it's worked well for her. Can I do one more example? Another cool example so this was in Rawalpindi, Pakistan, and it was a community that was living on the banks of a river in a fairly informal settlement. Sometimes they're called slums, but that's not a nice word for people who live there. So informal settlement is a word I'm trying to use instead. And this river would flood every once in a while, and it was anyway. They got a grant from a foundation to talk to people about what to do about the flooding, and they talked about building seawall, and they held community meetings. Like, they got that this needed to be community driven, so they held community forums, and they talked about seawalls, erecting walls around the river. They talked about relocating the entire community, and one of the people running the meetings sort of noticed that women weren't speaking in the meeting. So they held a separate women-only community meeting, which is already a really insightful thing to be doing, to thinking about how we create spaces that are safe for everybody in the community to be able to speak. And in the women's-only meeting, they said, the problem isn't flooding. It's flooded here forever. We're used to that. We get that. We know how to deal with flooding. The problem is there's raw feces in the floodwater now. And so they mobilized around building latrines where people could be safe to go to the bathroom, especially women. And I just think that's an interesting example of thinking about climate adaptation through a lens of the soon and the salient, but in ways that, that sewage treatment plant also is an environmental conservation effort, and it adds to the resilient capacity of the community that they can draw on then to adapt to climate. And I thought that was a cool example.
Did you want to add it?
Well, just briefly, one thing I do a lot, rather than telling my own stories, reported stories, is pointing to really great work by others. And 2015, there's a young journalist named John Sutter who used to work at CNN. He was we talked about this at dinner last night. He was going around the world ahead of the Paris negotiations that year, doing a series on this idea of 2 degrees. And he went to Oklahoma, the heart of oil country. I don't know if anybody's from Woodward County, Oklahoma here, but he went there and he started just interviewing people. But as you said, not centering it on climate. Just, what's your experience with weather? And what do you do with your energy? And amazing things happen when you just have a conversation and you do a lot of listening and not directed questions. Like, how worried are you about global warming? That's a directed question. I don't pay attention to surveys that say that. When you see these polls, people say they're more worried about global warming because we asked them. But when you actually just ask someone, what worries you? Global warming is literally never on the list for like 90% of people consistently, because you're worried about here and now stuff. So anyway, here's this guy in Woodward County, blue shirt, tie, works for an oil company at an executive level. And he says at one point, God controls the environment. And he says at another point, well, he describes to the journalist that he helped to pay for the monument. There's like a playground in town that's dinosaurs and people all together, because he's a creationist and he thinks the world started 6,000 years ago. So as you're watching this interview, you think, oh my God. And then he says, we have half of our roof covered with solar panels and we plan to get off the grid entirely as soon as I can. And just let that sort of simmer in your head for a minute. And you start to realize the reason he wants to get off the grid, and when you read the longer piece, it's clear, he's a libertarian. He's a do-it-yourselfer. He's like our dear departed Wes Shaw. Why should I pay a utility, a check every month? My wife is sitting over there, and my mother-in-law. Why should I pay a check to a utility when I can make my own energy? Gosh darn it. But the same reasoning is why he would never vote for Hillary Clinton. That was 2015. So that says so many things to me. It says, listen, it says, think about what your goals might be that could overlap with someone else's goals who will never agree with you on some big principle that you think should be in the foreground, but maybe it shouldn't be in the foreground. And maybe it is an issue you can make a lot of progress with. And it'll always be tough because, remember, Oklahoma is never going to be a participant in climate legislation in D.C., even though this guy wants to get off the grid in Woodward County. So it's challenging and a long journey, but there are opportunities everywhere.
So some of you have just shared a little bit about what makes engagement meaningful or how you might engage communities. And I'm going to combine two of my questions sort of into one. And so one is if you want to share a little more about what engagement means to you. And so it's a word that a lot of nonprofits and organizations throw around a lot. And I think it's important that we examine the word a little bit and dig into what does it actually mean and what makes engagement real and meaningful. And so share a little bit more about your experiences with that, or sort of if that's part of staying connected to your audiences. So as communicators, we do this work because we want the information to be useful and we want it to be relevant. And so how do you, in addition to or beyond engagement, how do you make sure that your work is relevant to your audiences, to readers of the Globe, to your audiences, to your communities? How do you make sure that the communications you are producing are relevant and useful?
So we ask people what is relevant and useful to them. Our first question is always, what are your priorities? And even that question is intentional. We started asking people, what are your problems? And I had a mayor once say to me, I'm tired of being asked that question.
How do you pick the communities you go to?
So the question was, how do we pick the communities we go to? We get introduced to communities by organizations that work with communities, that have long-standing relationships, trusted partners to the communities. And we found that's absolutely essential, right? If we showed up as a science group and said, hey, we're a bunch of scientists, we're based in DC, we'd really like to help. Yeah. So partners, organizations that people know and trust, they say, these people are actually worth talking to. They're not like the rest of them DC folks. And then we actually don't talk. We actually listen. We try to just really sit down and ask people about their priorities. And that, what I was starting to say about the priorities, a mayor once said to me, I'm tired of rich cities having priorities and poor cities having needs. And that was another powerful moment for me, because a lot of times I think we approach science engagement with what science research, education researchers call a deficit model. We assume people don't know crap. And people don't like being told they don't know crap, because they do know stuff. It's not crap. Like people have, and that's the other part, right? People are experts about the places they live. They're experts about what they see. And so by beginning from that place of, tell us about who you are and what you care about and what you value and what you want for your future, and then let's see if we can find a way that our skill set of science can be beneficial to that. That begins a conversation and a partnership that's easier to maintain.
I love that answer. And we were on a hike this morning, so I got to hear more about these examples of engagement, which go really deep. And so a community newspaper, it's both a community newspaper and kind of a regional and national newspaper at the same time. And, our newsroom, which my colleagues are responsible for, does the work of going and figuring out what's happening in the community. And increasingly, there's this awareness that has to be done in a really deep way across all sorts of different parts of the community. It can't just be the normal, usual suspects that have always gotten to talk to the media. It has to be people of all different walks of life. And in our opinion pages and in the Globe's sort of opinion and commentary and ideas section, which is the part where my team gets the privilege of being part of the conversation and helping shape a conversation with our readers, we have, we curate letters to the editor. That's a long tradition going back almost as long as the newspaper itself, which is almost 150 years old. It'll be 150 in 2022. And that is one way of hearing from the community. But what's really apparent and become apparent in recent years is that there's only a small slice of people who will write letters to the editor. You have to kind of believe that your voice matters and that you ought to be published in the pages of the Globe to take the time to write that letter. And you might know that the Globe gets tons and tons of letters every day. We get hundreds of letters every day, and that the chances of getting published are not that high. And so we've had to be more thoughtful about how do we engage the community in a way that's more proactive, also using new media tools, because generationally, with younger people, they're not going to write a letter to the editor, but they are on social media. And so they can participate in the conversation that way. And they may not just respond to something we've written. We may need to ask them targeted questions. So we often go out and we ask targeted questions. And just a simple example of that is, for years and years and years, maybe decades, well before I was the editorial page editor of the Boston Globe, we've printed the Declaration of Independence on our page on July 4th, so that people can be reminded of the founding principles and ideas of this country and of our democracy. But we wanted to really understand, how does that exist today? How is that living today for people? So we went out, we're asking people the question, asking our community members the question, what does the Declaration of Independence mean to you? And we got all kinds of answers, some very critical, some very, inspiring, some people who were carrying it with them. Some people said basically nothing. It doesn't mean anything to me, which is surprising. So, trying to be very pointed about getting that community engagement. And then really, and this also relates to a conversation I was having with all of you on the hike, some of you on the hike, and some other folks from the Institute. We are trying to think really differently about who is an expert and who gets to be an op-ed writer on our pages. So op-eds are those columns that guests from the community write for our pages. And as an example of how we're thinking about this differently than it has been in the past, we've had a beautiful writer named Mary Ann DeUrso writing for us throughout 2020 and 2021. She writes a column called The Grocery Stories, and she, in addition to being a great writer and a former grade school English teacher, she is a clerk in a grocery store, and she has had an experience as an essential worker, as a frontline worker in the pandemic that is very unlike the experiences of many other people in the community. And in addition to publishing epidemiologists and policy experts and academics on the pandemic, we felt it was really important to center expertise within the community itself in different ways, including from people who are doing the work of keeping us eating and alive. And so that's just one example of trying to engage the community in a way that is about amplifying voices that aren't always heard from.
This is great. Just briefly, a couple things. There's a newspaper in Ohio. Actually, there are some Ohio people here. The Akron Beacon Journal was kind of fading away as a newspaper. And I met the editor, Doug Opplinger. He was the managing editor through a couple of Pulitzer Prizes and stuff. And they were struggling, and along came the opioid epidemic. And the community through the Ohio region, everywhere in America where we are, was devastated, and people freaked out. And they decided to try a flipped model of journalism, and it became a website called Your Voice Ohio. I think it's yourvoiceohio.org. And they would hold town meetings. This is before COVID. And where they would hold the meeting, they weren't sending a reporter to a town meeting. They were holding a convening with some experts, with some officials, with community members, asking those open questions. What can we do for you? Sort of like Thriving Earth Exchange, but a journalism model. And it revived their trust with their readers. It revived their own engagement with the stories around them. And it's a very valuable model that could be propagating more, I think. It excites me tremendously. That could happen in any small newsroom, anywhere. And a lot of small papers operate that way more organically anyway. And just briefly, I guess in a way I've become a reporter on the information environment as much as the physical environment. And so I'll pass along just a couple of other examples of things that excite me tremendously. One is a young Yukon marine biologist, a squid biologist named Sarah McNulty, maybe 5 years ago, said on Twitter, why don't we just start Skype a Scientist? It's a hashtag, # Skype a Scientist. And it was a way to just put up a flag for any school teacher or student group or librarian to say, here's a scientist who's willing to talk to you by Zoom or whatever. This is, again, pre-COVID. And now it's a significant nonprofit organization that has gotten thousands of scientists, well, at least hundreds, I think thousands actually, into schoolrooms, just so kids can interact directly with someone, not just in the field, but it's very exciting if there's someone out on an island or a boat. And that can be, Skype a lobsterman, Skype a park ranger. We can all connect. Zoom has been so frustrating, and it's so unidimensional, and it feels horrible, but it can be a dynamic. These connections can actually be meaningful. And one last thing that's like that, a guy who used to work in the White House, Dan Hammer, I don't know if he was there when you were there, Office of Science and Technology Policy. He's a technologist and an economist, and he came up with a way, the website is earthrise.media, earthrise.education, the word education, not edu, through which students in Massachusetts and in Iowa last year, before lockdown and during lockdown, were sifting NASA satellite data, images of the Amazon rainforest, where gold mining was intruding into Indian reserves. And that led, their work looking at these images led to a Reuters news article, a big package that pressured Brazil to crack down on these miners. So kids in Iowa and Massachusetts were helping to identify an impact on an Indian reservation territory in the Amazon through an interface that has no real cost to it except the time people put into it. And those things just excite me tremendously. And I think we're just scratching the surface of what's possible.
Passing the mic gives us time to pause. So this idea of other voices and thinking beyond the traditional experts, which I think you've all touched on, brings up the idea of language and jargon. So when we think about experts, one of the ways that expertise is flexed and manifests is through jargon. And through Schoodic Institute science communication trainings, we talk a lot about language and jargon. And I continue to learn how so much of our science vocabulary carries tones of oppression, of racism, of violence in the metaphors that we use and the terminology. And realizing that efforts to make science more inclusive and incorporate diverse perspectives sort of carries over to the words that we use. And so as you've had these experiences of elevating other voices and making space for other voices. I wonder if you've had a similar experience of sort of confronting and reflecting about the language that we use, and maybe if you could share any examples.
So I think about it, I think I would tilt the question a little bit differently to relate to how I'm thinking about it, but I hope it answers your question. But I think part of the challenge we have is that the fruits of science, the benefits of science, have not been evenly distributed, whether that's technologies like the phones that many of us would have in our pockets, or the scientific insights that yield medical treatments that are not accessible to everyone in the world. And so just as wealth is unevenly distributed, so is what science has offered. And so the language of science will be received by different audiences very differently because of that, because of both exclusion and then outright exploitation. If you think to the Tuskegee experiment, where hundreds of Black men were, basically left untreated with syphilis for a study that led to treatments that still don't benefit large swaths of the population. So we have a sort of problem in the approach of science needing to be more inclusive in addition to the thinking about it, and that then in addition to the language. But I think it all kind of works together. To your point, I think language can reinforce how we think. Obviously, language can limit how we think. And the example that I would share of language limiting how we think really relates to taxonomy, which everyone should forgive my Latin for a second. There is a butterfly. There's a neotropical butterfly, Atraptes fulgurator, or the two-barred flasher butterfly, which is a beautiful, if you look up the image, has a blue body and blue streaks on its wings. And so the Western taxonomy, the Western person who discovered it, sorry, I shouldn't say Western because this is still Western Hemisphere, but in the sort of taxonomy system, the Linnaean system that we know comes from a certain tradition, labeled this butterfly as one species, and that's the name I just shared with you. But it turns out with DNA barcoding of this species of butterfly that it's actually 10 different species and not just one species. And an indigenous language to Mesoamerica, present in Costa Rica, had actually 10 different words for this butterfly. And people may know, some of you may know this example. I see a couple of people nodding. But so I think what's so interesting about language is that, the English language has taken on so many words from other countries, from French culture, from, all over the world. And indigenous knowledge, indigenous languages, and the ways that people have of characterizing the natural world have a lot to offer us in terms of our understanding, right? It took until we had the DNA technology to understand what people living and interacting with these insects knew about them for a very long time. And so we need to think about a symbiosis between our understanding and aided by science and technology and the understanding of people and communities. But we also need to think about how our language might limit our ability to see what is much more rich and varied and interesting than just a single term can offer.
I don't want to go on too long, so I'm going to have to try to really bottle this up, but because there's so much to say. In the early 90s, I got a contract to write a book about an Indian tribe in British Columbia, focused on an elder who was the last person alive from his culture who had, as a child, had learned their traditional songs and dances and language. He had been studied by an American linguist from the University of Massachusetts, a botanist from UBC, and it was an unbelievably interesting story that got very complicated very quickly. He was an abuser as a grandfather. Yet his abuse came from his time in those Canadian schools that you've been reading about recently. And it all got so entangled in layers. I ended up moving to the New York Times quicker than I was able to finish the book. I never finished it. And I'm actually happy about it now, because amid all the richness and drama and tragedy, I now look back and think, what was my right to tell that story anyway? This young novelist from that same community, Eden Robinson, who should tell that story. So in a way, that's my most powerful experience with that question. It's like, you know, any of you have dealt with, if there's any indigenous people here, of course, you know, the appropriated knowledge, appropriated artwork is a huge wrenching problem, not just territory, across the Americas, not just the Americas, Southeast Asia, everywhere. So I think we have to be asking ourselves. The last thing I want to say, though, is that goes way beyond words. 2 years ago, at Columbia, the diversity officer at the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, Coeli Dutt, wrote a Nature paper in the journal Nature, in which she had laid out the data, showed that basically Earth science has the same lack of blackness it had 40 years ago now. It's not just about words, it's about participation. And that's a crisis if we can't figure out how to get at those, the institutional barriers to normalize that opportunity for everyone.
Can I jump on that one? Yeah, so that one resonates. Andy's right. So I'm an earth scientist by background, and we have the lowest rate of minority participation of any science. Physics does better than us. Yeah, that's usually a laugh line. One of the jobs I had for a while was working in a program at a national lab to help students minority students. And I'm even struggling with that word, right? Because minority is a sort of a label. And you need to ask, why are we considering this group a minority? What does it mean to be a minority? Is there a better term? Minoritized, I've heard people say. That's passive voice. I don't love passive voice, right? Anyway, the student came to me and he said, Raj, I want to do, and it was an amazing program. Students were incredibly successful. They were mentored. They were supported. They were partnered with lab scientists to do projects. They got into grad school. They were successful by every measure. Anyway, the student came to me and he said, Raj, I really want to do work on an Indian reservation. I'm a Wampanoag Indian. It would be important for me to work in Indian country somewhere. Doesn't have to be in Massachusetts. It can be anywhere. And we had 350 scientists at our lab, and not one scientist was working on an Indian reservation. And it sort of occurred to me at the moment that was our diversity problem. That what we were essentially saying to these students was, come to our lab and work on our problems in the ways we define work, doing the science we call valid. And another student in this program said to me that she felt like she had to unzip herself and leave herself in the parking lot before she could come to work. So we've created this culture and this norm that says certain things are okay and other things aren't, and certain questions are valid and others aren't. And I think that the fundamental piece here that we're all agreeing on is every community, every person deserves the right and the opportunity to ask and answer their scientific questions. Science should be a human right. And what do we have to do to step up to that responsibility? How do we open the doors of academia so that every person, every community can use these tools to understand the world they live in and to make decisions about the world they live in, along with all their other kinds of knowledges? And I guess maybe that would be the question.
That's a great question, and I think we've spent a lot of time on community and engagement, but Kevin's here and I'm looking right at him. We are going to talk about the park, so don't worry. He's probably like, aren't they going to talk about the national park? And we are. So we're going to talk about the park as a community and a place where science happens. So Acadia is really experiencing rapid climate change. And the managers are considering it so rapid, and the changes are so extreme. So 3.5 degrees average annual temperature is much warmer. Winters are warming much faster than the rest of the year. The growing season has lengthened. Insects and pests that previously couldn't survive in Acadia are surviving and spreading. The red pine scale being one of them. Sea levels are rising. Erosion is increasing. All of these problems, it's changing human visitation patterns, these changes in temperature. And so these changes to the parks make it hard to preserve them unimpaired without doing something. And so managers in Acadia are considering directing change. So things like helping new tree species to come to the park by planting new species. It's called assisted migration, you may have heard about. And these are controversial actions that the park is considering. And that's some of the science we do at Schoodic Institute, is to help run experiments to evaluate what those kinds of decisions, what kind of impact they might have. But a lot of people recognize that just resisting change, something that the Park Service has done since its inception, is no longer enough. That to resist change is actually to be just as much an intervention as to plant new tree species. And so these are issues about thinking about the future and solutions. And our challenge is thinking about how do we engage the public in these issues, and how can we communicate about them, and how can we think about parks going into the future. Bina, I don't know if you want to talk about the idea of sort of heirlooms and passing them on, and this idea that parks are going to change through time, and so are human experiences of parks, and that's something that sort of came to mind when I was thinking of that question.
So I actually use the national parks as an example a lot when I talk about the challenge we have of trying to do things on behalf of future generations. So, we don't really know when we bury nuclear waste in the ground from our nuclear energy reactors or nuclear weapons that have been tested and some used. We don't know how future generations in the lifetime of radioactive waste, how they're going to stumble upon these sites and what they might think about them. So there's a sort of way in which society is changing so rapidly that it's hard for us to know exactly what future generations are going to experience. If you just think back to when you were growing up versus today, and the way that technology has rapidly changed everything, the way that the planet is changing. So I think there's a sense in which we have to be humble about thinking we know what's right for the future, and also planning for the future, because we have to make changes. But there's also this need to protect and preserve what has been important and what has sustained us, what has sustained life on Earth, what has sustained human communities and civilization and made us healthy for future generations. So we can't just say, we don't know what's coming, so let's just live for today and party like there's no tomorrow. So how do you reconcile that need to plan for the future, but this inability to really know what future generations' lives are going to be like? And the way I think about that is to think about shared heirlooms. So we leave heirlooms in our families, jewelry or pieces of furniture that we've inherited that were important to our grandfathers or grandmothers or further back. And then we preserve them and we shepherd them to the next generation, and the next generation finds a use for them, and then the next generation finds a use for them. And I find that to be a more useful way to look at these problems of the future, because what it means is that each generation is going to use and create meaning out of these heirlooms, and is going to engage with them and also protect them for the next. So you don't have to predict many, many decades in the future. You just have to be the good steward or the shepherd of that heirloom going forward. And I think the national parks are a great example of that, because they are the reason why the national parks remain something that are protected in this country and are given resources, is that generation after generation creates meaning in them, visits them, has experiences in them. If nobody ever went to Yosemite or no one ever came to Acadia, after a few decades, it might be easy for Congress to just pull the funding. Or, we saw this actually with 2 new national monuments that were established by, just by President Obama, and then President Trump tried to rescind some of the protections out west in Utah for Bears Escalante, I think is one of them. I'm trying to remember if I'm remembering both of the names, or if I'm combining them together. So if someone knows, shout it out. So those parks that were newly created, it was easier to kind of pull back because people didn't have experiences in these new areas. So I think all of this is to say that we have to have some ability to act on the information we have about the changing climate and what we know is coming in the future. But we need to do it in a way that preserves as many options for the future. And so I think this idea of treating the most precious resources we have, not everything in your family's basement can be an heirloom, and therefore not everything that we have going on today should be protected for the future. But our forests, our clean rivers, clean air to breathe, these are things we need to protect for the future. And so if we just think about how do we preserve as many options for future generations to use these precious, precious resources, I think it can provide us a way to cut through both the murkiness of the future, but also our responsibility to it.
You're asking the best questions. Really, thank you. There's a couple things here. I probably have a question for the park folks on what are the statutory obligations that shackle you to the existing ecosystem, et cetera, in a park. I wrote a thing in 2005 about the Burmese pythons that were coming into the Everglades because pet owners had released them, and they're not going away. And the budget of the Park Service biologists there was being eaten up, literally, by having to study how to extirpate the species. They actually weren't able to do the work to think about climate change and all the other things. So there's I don't know how big a deal that is here. I'd love to know. But on a bigger scale, this resonates with what Bina was saying. 3 or so years ago, the University of Illinois Law School, someone invited me to go to Sequoia National Park to a bit of a retreat on the word wildness, not the word wilderness, but wildness. And we did a ton of reading, incredible reading of all these early thinkers and naturalists and stuff. And amid all that change, you can absolutely preserve wildness. This is a pretty settled peninsula. It's not, no grizzly bears or pythons here. But I think you know what I mean. So that's something, the functionality of places can be preserved and extended. It does require some letting go, though. There's a whole journal. In 2002, we did a big special report for the New York Times on managing planet Earth as if management is something we can do at planet scale. One of my many mistakes to think that was something we could put in a headline. But a chunk of what I rewrote about was the end of the idea of like restoration ecology. What are you restoring an ecosystem to? What's your baseline? How romantic is that baseline? Is it a 19th century white baseline? Is it an indigenous pre-colonial baseline? You might not want that. It's a lot of fire, actually. The North America burned like hell. You think the fires now are significant? You should go back 500,000 years. It burned way more. So it's like we're already making those choices. So getting rid of or thinking very carefully about when to use a term like restoration is a thing that I think would be valuable in thinking about parks or climate policy going forward. It's like if I were president, I would be saying build forward better, not build back better, because anytime you put RE in front of a word, rebuild, restore, we're talking about some envisioning going backward in time. And that's liberating the future, like you were talking about. Roman Kirsniak has a book, The Good Ancestor. There are a lot of people thinking deeply about this idea of what do we do now to conserve some future that isn't a future necessarily that we would even want, but it's a future that gives people who are coming the capacity for wildness, for example.
We had a good hike this morning and had a chance to talk about some of this. Building on this, so this is going to bring together Led Zeppelin and the Pamir Mountains and software development, if I can pull it off. So the Pamir Mountains, the we worked with a community there, and they have what they call ecological calendars. So instead of saying on September 1st you plant this tree, they say 3 days after you hear this bird song for the first time, this seed can start to grow. And the challenge they're facing is not that their calendars don't work, it's that for 50 years they haven't used the calendars. Because the calendars were never static. They were never a calendar. They were a process that you went through every year, and every year's process prepared you for the next year's calendar. So this idea of something that doesn't evolve and doesn't change was completely alien to the way they thought about the landscape. And so the project we worked with was to help them bring their calendars back up to date, because in not using them for 50 years in this region, which is a mountainous region, climate change had just run rampant and all of the old signals didn't match. And so they just needed to be brought back up to date so they could start the process of constant revision again, right? And what's lovely about that is this idea that you don't expect staticness. You expect, we'll make a decision, and then we'll evaluate what's happening, we'll think about what's working and what's not, and we'll make another decision, or we'll make the next decision. And I think that idea of constantly iterating is what's captured in the Led Zeppelin song when they say there are 2 roads you could go down, but in the long run there's still time to change the one you're on. And the last piece, if I can do this is what's called agile development in software. In the old days, software engineers used to sit down with people and say, tell me everything you want to do, and then go away and build something and bring it back and say, here it is. And then the customer would say, that's not what I asked for. So they got in the habit of doing something little, bringing it back, getting some feedback, and iterating. And I think those ideas give us a way to start tackling really hard challenges, sort of a baby step at a time, in a way where we're constantly learning and constantly growing. And if you can couple that with the idea that anytime you're making decisions, it's messier and harder and more fraught when you bring more people into the conversation, but it's almost always a better decision in the end.
That inspired me to say something. So I think this is so important, what you're talking about, Raj, and I think the idea that people are going to need to engage in making these iterative decisions in consensus and collaboration and community, which is hard, but it takes work. To me, kind of just underscores something else about science communication, particularly as it relates to global change and the climate crisis, which is that we need to talk about this in ways and give people resources in ways and bring to bear their resources and expertise in ways that are not about telling people there's doomsday coming and you need to take action right now to avoid doomsday. And if you don't take that action, doomsday is going to come. And if you do take that action, doomsday is not going to come. Because all of those things are debilitating sort of ways of looking at this. And what's really needed, to Raj's point, is ongoing engagement. We're going to be dealing with this, right? Certainly for my lifetime, for the lifetime of young people alive today and well beyond. And we need to feel, I mean, just again, to return to sort of the biases that Andy mentioned and the cognitive science around this that I've looked into, that we need people to be able to feel agency in order for them to engage with futures that look very dark. People need to find their points of what can I do to affect that future in order to feel like they can engage with it and care about it and not just bury their head in the sand or say, look, I'm going to deal with the here and now again because the here and now is more concrete and I can affect that. So I think a lot of this is about communicating the ways in which people can engage and can affect change, which thankfully there are ways for people to do that.
Bina, you've written about thinking about the space for people to engage and spaces to have these conversations, and that I think you just sort of wondered aloud in your book that parks and sort of town commons is still a common space. And so just reacting to your comment, it makes sense that the park is a good setting to have these conversations, and it is a place that a lot of people have a stake in. And so it it makes sense and makes my last question make sense with our larger conversation also. So we're just a couple more questions. And I want to try to get, so we have sort of 2 more questions and then last words. And I want to get to the question in the middle. And this came up, is this idea of youth. So at Schoodic Institute, we have a huge focus on students and early career scientists. We have a whole crew of awesome technicians and interns this summer who will be, out on the coast at 5:30 in the morning, redoing a survey of seaweed that happened in 1966. And so we think a lot about youth and supporting future scientists and future science communicators. And I just wonder if you could share a little bit, all of you work with youth in some way. So Andy, this idea of regeneration, which was a recent program that you did, and this, this idea of heirlooms and other ways of thinking about youth and how they can be part of some of our solutions.
I'm blanking on regeneration. I'm not sure. I can't remember what that's about. But
it's the idea that this is the regeneration, and they're gonna.
Building forward and progenerative even. I guess what I'd say there is, what's really hard for me right now is talking to young people. Greta Thunberg and Alexandria Villaseñor, who I've gotten to know her. I don't know Greta, but Alexandria is 14 years old. She's incredibly passionate. She's an incredible utilizer of social media. Everything is urgent and an emergency. And for someone our age, to find a way to talk constructively with that generation in a way that doesn't get to that sort of, when I was your age, I was also impatient, blah, 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 And I had a conversation with her and with Kim Stanley Robinson on stage, one on stage and one on a virtual stage after pandemic, where he writes about the climate future and she is the climate future. And that felt like a way around this question of directly saying, well, what's your definition of climate emergency? And if it's an emergency, does that mean government has emergency powers? And who would that affect? Where would those windmills go? Where someone would say this shouldn't be on my lawn. It's that's one of the toughest things is right now, I think, for a lot of us who are older, to think about how to engage with kids. My wife, who's an educator, she's teaching teachers how to engage with kids, and maybe she might have answers. But and on social media, I just go silent as opposed to. So I don't know. That's the toughest question right now. Is well, I'm sure you deal with this too. When a kid says there's only 10 years left, and what do I do? And how do you engage on that constructively? I think it's an open question for me. I don't know.
So I feel differently about this than you, Andy. I do think it's the idea that there's only 10 years left doesn't bear out in the science, like that particular framing of this, right? It's always going to matter what we do, and what we do now, however small it might seem, will make a difference in making this problem more manageable, making this crisis more manageable. So I think it's not helpful to tell people it's now or never, or we're done for, because it's not factually true, and also it's very disempowering. It makes people feel like they have no choice or agency, and if we fail now, they might as well give up, which we need people to not give up for a very long time. But where I disagree is I feel that young people, with their message, even if there's some amount of alarmism or urgency that might affect particular messages like that, they're doing for us what I mentioned before, which is bridging the imagination gap. Young people represent the future to us in a very specific and personal way. And I think it's why Greta Thunberg has captured the imagination of people around the world. She has the moral authority to talk about the future the way the Lorax spoke for the trees and Dr. Seuss, in a way that people who might not be around in 2100 don't have that authority. So it's helping people relate to this problem of the future in a way that she's saying, in Alexandria and others are saying, you can't look away from us. We are here. And I think that has had a role in pushing political leaders and pushing business leaders. It plays an important part. And I guess I'm just of the mind that this is such a complex crisis, and it requires so many different approaches. And there's not one silver bullet to how we solve the climate crisis, which I know Andy will agree with, and probably Raj too. And similarly, I don't think there's one silver bullet in terms of how we communicate about it.
Oh, I agree. I'm 100% in agreement. Do you want to? No, that's fine.
I would just amplify that. I mean, I think this is those. It would be great to have a place where there would be room for all of these voices to work together to get sort of the communication going. And I mean, to underscore the point you've all made, like there was a long time in climate change communication where, like, if you graphed our story, it was this. And like, that's just a bad story. Like, nobody would pay to watch that movie. Well, maybe a few German art films. But other than that, like, and I think we're finally getting better at not only telling a better story, but building the story, right? It's a true story. People are making small changes, and those small changes are starting to add up. And things like Greta's work, even, it's a nice complement to sort of an entree into a larger conversation that sort of grapples. But the moral clarity is a good voice to add to the mix, and it hasn't been in the mix. So I think kind of like you're both right.
It's in the mix because of social media. Severin Suzuki spoke at the Earth Summit in 1992 as a 14-year-old, and electrifying, and she was on the nightly news. But it's social media, I think, is the thing that has changed things, and it has allowed Fridays for Future to become a global coordinated movement. Try that 20 years ago, before Twitter. You know, how would kids have done that? They would have found a way, perhaps, but it wouldn't have been instantaneous. And you know, at a practical scale, unfortunately, the vision that Greta presents also presents an opportunity for those who don't want climate change to be addressed, because of the alarmist qualities. They'll use her just as much as those who are pushing for change will benefit from her. And I worry in our current political dynamic, it doesn't really maybe change things. And I also worry when I see Davos or the UN. There was a panel she tuned into, which was so clearly, so patently, wealthy people on stage, you know, and here's Greta. And it almost gives them a pass for really not truly engaging on the climate problem by having her come in and give one of her little incendiary speeches. That bothers me. It's not her. I'm not criticizing her. I'm criticizing how she's utilized.
So that's sort of suggesting we shouldn't tokenize our youth, but we should listen to them carefully. And I think some of your comments, so this is the sort of new question. I've written a lot about the role of the arts in helping to communicate science and helping us. So I think the arts play a big role in imagination. And Schoodic Institute, we do a lot with the arts here. I think there's some artists in residence in Acadia who are staying with us right now. And so if you could share quickly just reactions to that, or your own experiences with the arts, or how you've incorporated, so Andy, maybe data visualization, or the importance of sort of you know, other sense of sight and sound and other things besides words, and what the role of the arts might be in communicating science and engaging people with it.
We, one of the projects we got involved with was in New Orleans, and it was, Amy Stelly started this project, and she was concerned about the I-10 over freeway, built right through the center of Claiborne Avenue, which was a thriving African-American community, destroyed, and I'm a little nervous to say this out loud because I don't think I have these numbers exactly right, but well, I'll be conservative. It destroyed hundreds of oak trees, mature growth oak trees. It put families out of their homes, and it decimated a vibrant African-American business community. And Amy wanted to remove this freeway, and she started working to collect data. She invited students to create art about the data that they collected. It's a really cool project. Public Lab, which is this very cool nonprofit, was involved. They did DIY sensors The kids built DIY sensors and then launched them using helium balloons up over the freeway to collect air quality measurements over the freeway. And then luckily none came down in the freeway. And then they'd collect and then they'd make art about this. And it became a rallying point for the entire community. And sort of through processes I don't understand, it built and built and built. And this removal of this highway is mentioned in the infrastructure bill that's part of the new administration's infrastructure package. And I think that's an example of all of these things, right? The way art and science can go together, the way teachers and students and communities can work together, and the way sort of communities can start to ask their scientific questions in their own authentic voice. So that would be the tie-in for the art, and it would maybe bleeds back a little bit into our last question too.
Yeah, I think art is fantastic in many ways. But being reminded, I think it was in Germany, someone here might remember, but there was this sculpture in a flood tank and it was politicians talking about climate change. And so these statues of mostly men talking to each other, and the flood, when the tank flooded, it would basically flood and rise. And I think, I don't know, there's just so much in terms of metaphor and emotional connection and imagination and wonder. And I think that to me connects back to the national park, standing where we were today on Schoodic Head or by the water and just experiencing the wonder and awe of this place. That's a way in for people, right, to understand global change. And I think art can provoke awe and wonder in a very similar way to encountering, natural beauty. And so these are just all different ways that we need to invite people in, and they go hand in hand with the science. None of this is to say the science isn't absolutely necessary and crucial, right? We need to know what's going on, and we need to understand it at a very deep level. We need to understand it at a granular level in the places that matter to people, the places where people have memories and want to understand how to manage those places as they change in a warming planet. And it matters at the big abstract level where we're trying to understand what's really going on with our atmosphere. So to help people grapple with all of that, I think we need all hands and all tools on deck.
And like the other things we were talking about, it's let 1,000 flowers bloom. There's so much activity that's unbelievable. I launched a webcast when I was at Columbia during pandemic. And we've done 200 of these every Sunday. The show, I'm on hiatus now, is focused on the arts, especially music. And we've explored, think about the visual art that made a difference during the pandemic. There was a New Zealand illustrator who created these incredibly effective visualizations of the, what do you call it, tamp down the, what was that initial thing we had to do? The curve, flatten the curve. The artwork that evolved around flatten the curve was fantastic, and one of the great ones came from New Zealand. It spread globally. Millions of people saw this animation, and it made a difference. And in the climate context or the environment context, there's a whole field of emergent arts that are incredible. Stacy Levy, who's a sculptor, outdoor environmental artist in Pennsylvania. She does these works. Some of you, anyone been to Salt Lake and seen the spiral jetty, Smithson's construction, big bulldoze thing? She creates spiral wetlands, sort of echoing what he did in the lake with that static, non-active piece of art. She creates these floating, living spirals that remediate polluted wetlands. So it's art, it's beautiful to look at, and it's dynamic and active at the same time. Not every artwork should do that. So you have this, the field is amazing, and I'm a musician too. I've played at the Lobster Festival here more than once, and I have some songs. Liberated Carbon is my 3-minute ode to our history of our climate experience, and I'm not going to sing it for you right now. But so it's just, there's so much going on. It's fantastic. It's essential. It's just part of how humans interact with each other, and getting the science. At Columbia, we're really working on getting that interface between science and arts much more dynamic.
Well, hard to believe, but our conversation is coming to a close. And so we want to try to end with a little bit of an inspirational note. And this is just going to ask you each to share a thought on either your spark bird. So this is what our bird ecology program director, Seth Benz, likes to talk about, which is that the spark bird is the bird that first gets you into birding, or it might be a spark place that got you into nature, or the moment, the place, or the person where you got into science and caring about the future of the earth. Or you can also share with us a more recent moment that keeps you going in this work and that keeps you motivated. In our communication trainings, we often do this at the beginning of the workshop to kind of help people remember these moments, because it can help you kind of hang on when work gets hard and things get tough. And so if you could think about sharing your spark bird or moment or place or a recent moment that kind of keeps you going and motivated.
I guess I'll start. We were talking about art. Chris Jordan is this artist, and I was so taken by his work, I asked him for permission to talk about him, and he said I could. He wanted to make visceral what climate change means, and he was concerned that it was such an abstract thing for so many people. So he creates these amazing works that are like these giant canvases, and they'll look like one of my favorite looks like a bamboo forest. But as you walk closer and closer to this canvas, you realize it's actually stacks and stacks of paper bags. And it's 1.4 million paper bags, which at the time he made the art was the number of paper bags that were thrown away in the US every hour. Right? And I know you asked for happy, so it's good. So people said, these are amazing, these are effective, these are are you okay? And one of his other artworks that he created in response to that is called E Pluribus Unum, which ties to, and it's a mandala. But as you walk closer and closer, you realize that the lines in the mandala are actually words. And the words are the names of organizations. And it's the names of a million different organizations that are devoted to environmental conservation or indigenous rights or ecological sovereignty. And that is the spark. That there are a million organizations, there are a million allies, there are a million people, there are a million minds thinking about how we build better futures together.
I'm still thinking. I didn't. No, I think that really what's been inspiring me lately has more to do with the pandemic. I know there's a lot that is worrisome about how we responded to the pandemic, but seeing people in my neighborhood, for example, and in my community check in on each other, drive each other to vaccine appointments, make sure people have food when someone's spouse passes away, just seeing that kind of flourish in the pandemic in a way that I wasn't expecting. And I know it's not everywhere, but I think there are a lot of communities that, people sewing masks for each other, people just checking in on older people who've been isolated during the pandemic, people checking in on single people. That inspires me. And I think it connects to the climate crisis in that, I remember years back reading a book from the sociologist Eric Klinenberg, who wrote about the Chicago heat wave in the 90s. And they found that this was a deadly, deadly heat wave, for those who don't know. And there were two neighborhoods that were compared in this study, and they were both similar in that they were poor neighborhoods, predominantly black, with similar proportions of elderly people who are particularly vulnerable to heat waves. And in the community that had more locally owned restaurants, stores, more community centers where people knew each other more, they called it community cohesion or social cohesion. The death rates were very, very low, and even the illness rates were very low. And in this equivalent community that didn't have that kind of community cohesion, many more people died in the heat wave. And so I guess in a way we've all been trapped in our houses, and we've been more rooted to a sense of place recently. And I think that there could be the seeds there of that kind of community cohesion that saves people's lives in a pandemic, and that saves people's lives in a heat wave, and that might just be the place where we can start forging consensus and focusing on those solutions that are win-wins. And so that gives me hope.
So my first spark bird, I think, was when I was snorkeling back in Rhode Island when I was like 12 in a seagrass bed. And it was the first time I saw scallops swim. I thought, wow, mollusks, I didn't know that mollusks can swim, at least not scallops. Bivalves just, and that really got me going on the path I've been on ever since. And this for me, it's like a daily experience, essentially, as a reporter, including in this conversation just now, what I've been doing. So it's just fine. There's a spark every day.
I know that I definitely get a spark every time that I'm in Acadia. So it's a never-ending source of inspiration. I'd like to thank you all so much for your time this afternoon, and thank you all for coming. And I think Hannah's going to help close us out. Thank you so much. Give a
So, like Andy, I too was taking notes. But I thought, oh gosh, if I share my notes, then everybody who has had their own sort of things going in their own heads would sort of lose it, which I don't want to have happen. But a sense of wonder and awe, that's what the park is for. And shepherding this heirloom of this place, shepherding an heirloom of wonder and awe, but also thinking about if that is truly the functionality of this place. Where does science fit in? Going right back to the very beginning, science is necessary but not sufficient. We do need that imagination, that wonder, that awe, and that's what we need to be shepherding. I took a whole bunch of other things away, but that's sort of what's sticking in my head right now. I know you all have stuff that are stuck in your head as well, and it's all thanks to you and thanks to Catherine. So thank you very, very much for sharing what you've shared today, and thanks for moderating. So thank you all. Everybody drive safely and have a good evening.